The outbreak of war. Philippines is indeed a country rich in experiences of dealing with other countries. Unexpectedly, the Commonwealth era in the Philippines was interrupted by the Japanese in early 1940s when the latter country bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 8, 1941. Apparently, our country was not the target of Japan. It was the America. It was just happened that America occupied some areas in the Philippines for military base. The Second World War II is being regarded as the biggest and most destructive war in the world history. Even before the outbreak of the war in December 1941, Filipinos already made some preparations, and as the tension grew, President Roosevelt called General Douglas MacArthur again for active service, and he became the head of United States Armed Forces in the Far East. Japan occupied the Philippines for over 3 years until the surrender of Japan. A highly effective guerrilla campaign by Philippine resistance forces controlled 60% of the islands, mostly jungle and mountain areas. MacArthur supplied them by submarine and sent reinforcement and officers. Filipinos remained loyal to the United States, partly because of the American guarantee of independence, and also because the Japanese had pressed large numbers of Filipinos into work details and even put young Filipino women into brothels. The objective of Japan during World War II was to remove the United States as a Pacific power in order to gain territory in East Asia and the Southwest Pacific Islands. Japan opened a surprise attack on the Philippines just 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese troops attacked the islands in many places and launched a pincer drive on Manila. Aerial bombardment was followed by landings of ground troops in Luzon. The defending Philippine and United States troops were under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. Under the pressure of superior numbers, the defending forces, which is about 80,000 troops, and 4/5 of them are Filipinos, withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula and to the island of Corregidor at the entrance to Manila Bay, where they entrenched and tried to hold until the arrival of reinforcements.
Japanese rules for Filipinos. Salute to the Japanese soldiers when you meet them. The Japanese flag should be displayed at every house's door. Everybody must put the sunrise armband on the left arm. Everybody should have the certificate of residence. Wherever you see Japanese soldiers, you must welcome them and not escape from them. Unless you do not tell false prices, you will be paid reasonable. You are absolutely prohibited to walk until the sunset until the sunrise without carrying lamps. The walker who has not lights will be shot by the Japanese patrolling soldier without any warrants. Don't be fooled and bewildered by propaganda by communists, bandits, and Chinese. The incendiarism, accidental fire, and robbery will be punished. The holding of arms is allowed by the army, but the arms holder must report to the mayor it and get permission from. The jobless people can find one's job in the Japanese army. Be obedient to the orders of governor and mayor who are authorized. The Japanese influence. During the Japanese occupation of the Philippines during World War II, the Japanese influenced the government in the Philippines by enforcing a strict curfew, adding Japanese currency, instituting a military government, and reducing neighborhood government system by half. The occupation also cost the lives of over 1 million Filipino in the Philippines. The lives of the Filipinos during the occupation. During the occupation of the Japanese in the Philippines, they ran the Philippines with an iron hand. They instilled fear, declared martial law. They imposed curfews. They ordered that anyone who opposed them or even those who are just accused of going to against the Japanese were punished and killed. Singing of the national anthem and raising of the national flag was prohibited. Use of radios and transmitters was also prohibited. Political parties, elections, and public assemblies were put to a halt. School printing presses, telegraph, and radio stations were closed down. Everything was controlled by the Japanese. The Japanese propaganda. Japanese propaganda during World War II was designated to assist the ruling government of Japan during that time. Many of its elements were continuous with pre-war elements of statism in Showa Japan, including the principles of Kokutai, Hakuichu, and Bushido. New forms of propaganda were developed to persuade occupied countries of the benefits of the Greater Asia Prosperity Sphere, to undermine American troops' morale, to counteract claims of Japanese atrocities, and to present the war to the Japanese people as victorious. It started with the Second Sino-Japanese War, which merged into World War II. It is used a large variety of media to send its message.
Battle of Bataan was a World War II battle between the United States and the Philippine Commonwealth against Japan, and it was the most intense phase of Japan's invasion of the Philippines. In January 1942, forces of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy invaded Luzon and several islands in the Philippines archipelago after Pearl Harbor was bombed. In order to confront the Japanese army, General Douglas MacArthur, the commander-in-chief of both U.S. and Filipino forces in the islands, gathered all of his Luzon-based battalion on the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese had almost complete dominance over Southeast Asia by this period. To this day, the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island are the last remaining Allied strongholds in the region. British forces defeated the Japanese for 3 months in spite of their paucity of supplies, engaging them in a combat. Retreat southward at first, the delay lost the Japanese significant time and prevent a quick victory across the Pacific as the United American and Filipino forces made a desperate stand. The United States and Filipino prisoners of war were compelled into the Bataan Death March shortly after their surrender to Japanese soldiers of Bataan. With 76,000 soldiers surrendering in total, it was the largest American and Filipino military surrender since the American Civil War battles of Harper's Ferries. On April 9, 1942, Bataan fell under Japan occupation. Major General Edward P. King, the commanding general of the USAF Bataan Command, surrendered nearly 70,000 Filipino and American troops to Japanese force on this day in 1942. Don't give up, Bataan. Pinagsagang araw ng kagitingan, the Day of Valor, nang sumiklab ang World War II sa Pasipiko noong December 8, 1941. There was a close attack by the Japanese on territories covered by America such as the Philippines. And in response to this war plan, Orange 3 was implemented. And in this plan, Bataan will be the center of defense in the country. And between Cavite and Bataan, you can find the island of Corregidor. Filipino and American soldiers bravely defended the Bataan, one of the longest battles in Asia Pacific. So it became a symbol of hope of victory until the Bataan did not fall. Our soldiers were not professional soldiers, but most of our soldiers were reservists, ordinary people trained for 6 months, so standing up against these veteran Japanese troops. April 9, 1942. Via Voice of Freedom radio broadcast, 3rd Lieutenant Normando Ildefonso Reyes announced the message of Captain Salvador Lopez that Bataan has fallen. The siege and defense of Bataan lasted 93 days or only 4 months after the United States Army forces in the Far East fled to the island. During the event, leading up to General Edward B. King Jr.'s official surrender, But the Bataan command to Japanese troops. Philippines is the last country who gave up, who held it much longer. Nearly more than 70,000 soldiers surrendered and became part of the brutal death march. The Japanese forced the Filipino and American POWs from two corps to march. They walked more than 100 kilometers from Rivelas, Bataan to San Fernando, Pampanga. Amid the heat and a shortage of food and water, the POWs were subjected to intense heat as well as mistreatment by Japanese soldiers. After arriving at San Fernando, Pampanga, thousands of POWs were slain while attempting to flee or perish of exhaustion, starvation, and disease before reaching the city. Those who made it out told of the compassion of villagers who provided food and water. Many POWs were even aided in their escape. When they arrived, their small wagons were loaded and transported to Camp O'Donnell at Capas, Tarlac. POWs crammed inside boxcars with little food or drink. Despite the blazing heat, suffocation and weariness resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people inside them. After making it to Camp O'Donnell, those who made it were incarcerated and forced to live in filthy conditions until 1945, when they were released. Approximately 20,000 died in the death march. We remember the fall of the Bataan not to celebrate their defeat. We pay tribute to resilience, courage, and heroism of the Filipinos who fought for our country in World War II. With the number of young people who died, it was a tragedy that we hope it will never be repeated. The fact that it stayed that long was already a victory by itself. Filipinos who fought in the Japanese from 1941 until our liberation in 1945 rather, can be considered heroes. Apart from that, we also need to recognize the women and youth who showed heroism in their own way.
Magandang araw po sa ating lahat. Ngayon po ay ating tatalakayin ang pagbagsak ng Corregidor or the fall of Corregidor soldiers. Yung Corregidor, ito yung tinutuling na huling tanggulan. It is a tadpole-shaped island. Corregidor comes from the Spanish word corregir, which means to correct. It is the fortress at the entrance of Manila Bay. It also serves as the inspection area where all the documents of those who wants to enter the Manila Bay will be verified or checked. And ito rin yung naging evacuation o dito pumunta yung mga sundalong American at Pilipino pagkatapos na bumagsak yung Bataan noong April 9, 1942. Ang pagbagsak ng Bataan ay parang naging hudyat na rin ng pagbagsak ng Pilipinas. Ngunit may mga sundalong Pilipino at Amerikano na hindi nila lubusang tanggap ito. Naniniwala pa rin sila na may tutulong sa kanila na mga nagaling sa Estados Unidos at naniniwala din sila na babalik si General MacArthur. Sa Corregidor nila huling ipinagtanggol. Doon sila huling nagtanggol. Nang bumagsak yung Bataan, nailikas na mula sa Corregidor si Pangulong Quezon at ang kanyang pamilya papunta sa Estados Unidos. Nagsilbing himpilan niya ang Corregidor upang mapangalagaan siya sa mga Hapon. Ginawa ring ospital ang isang bahagi ng Corregidor upang ang mga sugatang general at mga opisyal ay maalagaan. Nang mapabagsak ang Bataan, ibinaling ni General Homa ang kanyang buong puwersa sa Corregidor. Binomba ito ng araw at gabi at pinalibutan ng hukboong mandagat. Ang mga gusali sa loob nito ay natupok o nasunog at yung mga nalalabing armas at kagamitan ay nawasak. Sapagkat isa nga itong isla, wala na silang maurungan, kaya napilitan na lamang silang sumuko. The Surrender of Corregidor and the Philippines, o ang pagsuko ng Corregidor at ng Pilipinas. Noong May 6, 1942, iniutos o nagbigay ng order si General Wainwright na ibaba yung American flag sa Corregidor para makaiwas sa massacre. General Wainwright make a surrender negotiations with General Homa. Gumawa siya ng kasunduang yung pagsusuko na sila. Pero si General Homa, sabi niya tatanggapin lang niya ang pagsuko ng mga Amerikano, Pilipino kung lahat, buong Pilipinas na kumakalaban sa kanila ay susuko din. At kahit parang mahirap yon, pumayag na rin si General Wainwright para maiwasan din yung pagganti ng mga Hapones. Ginawa lahat ni General Wainwright yung kanyang makakaya sa pagtatanggol sa Corregidor. Ngunit nasakop na sila ng mga Hapon. Wala nang sinumang general na makapagliligtas pa sa kanila. Kaya noong May 6, 1942, sinuko ni General Wainwright kay General Homa ang Corregidor kasama ang 12 sundalong Amerikano at Pilipino. Maswerte sila sapagkat hindi sa kanila ipinadanas yung Death March na pumatay sa maraming sundalong Pilipino at Amerikano noong mapabagsak ang Bataan. Matapos sumuko ni General Wainwright, dinala siya sa Maynila upang i-announce yung pagsuko ng Corregidor at yung forces ng Philippines sa forces ng Japan. Binasa rin niya dito sa radyo KCRH ang kautusan sa lahat ng commander sa buong Pilipinas upang sumuko sa mga Hapon. Sinunod naman ito ng mga nakabababang opisyal. Ngunit nanlaban pa yung mga ibang Pilipino sa pulo, gaya ng Panay, Cebu, Mindanao. Noong Mayo 10, 1942, isinuko ni General William F. Sharp Jr. na commander ng puwersa sa Bisaya at Mindanao ang bahaging ito. Sa pagbagsak ng Corregidor, bumagsak na rin at napasakamay ng Hapon ang buong Pilipinas. Kung para sa mga Amerikano ay tapos na kahit binaba na nila ang kanilang mga sandata, ang ilang mga Pilipino ay hindi sumuko sa mga Hapon. Pumunta sila sa kabundukan at doon ay naglunsad ng paikidigmang gerilya laban sa mga bagong mananakop o sa mga Hapon.